Circles Part 2: Difficult Conversations, Trauma, Crime, and Crisis. What I would like to frame this around is a cultural response. When a young person or a student experiences something traumatic, like a death in the family, or loss, or violence, there's clinical support, which is well and good. But I'm inviting everyone to reflect on what cultural interventions we might have as opposed to purely clinical. Could a classroom have a talking circle for a student experiencing a death in the family? Sometimes that's not appropriate, but let's reflect on ways our culture can be responsive to the ups and downs of life, and not just solely rely on our clinical responses. And so, in line with kind of thinking of cultural responses, I've got some words from the musical Hamilton to open up our conversation. There are moments that the words don't reach. There is suffering too terrible to name. You hold your child as tight as you can and push away the unimaginable. The moments when you're in so deep, it feels easier to just swim down. And to me, here's kind of a pop culture um, piece of art that's addressing trauma in a really on point way. So, this to say, we don't just need clinical responses. I think there are appropriate cultural responses too. And in the classroom, I think a talking circle could fit the bill. Not always, not always appropriate, but let's think about when this might be helpful and useful. So, trigger warning, this presentation includes discussion of trauma, abuse, discrimination, genocide, and that can be disturbing. And sometimes even discussing the symptoms of trauma, increased heart rate, etc., can be triggering for folks who've had experienced trauma. So, take care of yourself. If you need to pause or walk away or do this in multiple sittings or skip portions, that's all well and good. And another kind of cultural icon that I think speaks to circle practice beautifully is Tupac here on the right. It takes skill to be real. It's time to heal each other. And here's Frederick Douglass kind of opening up our topic in another quote. It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And this to me speaks to the potential we have as teachers reaching um, humans at various developmental stages where they're at pivotal moments in their lives when something might go wrong. And according to Harvard University, um, they've got a page on trauma and resilience. The number one indicator for resilience is a good relationship with a healthy adult. Healthy relationship with a positive adult. Number one indicator for resilience. Here are 10 kind of categories of um, trauma, or this comes from the ACEs study. So adverse childhood experiences. They kind of put 10 categories to adversity, including physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, and household stressors like having someone in your household with mental illness, substance abuse, domestic violence, incarceration, and parental separation and divorce. And for our conversation, we're using other kind of understandings of trauma, discrimination and bullying or experiences of injustice, poverty, violence, war, arrest, incarceration, detention, or kind of court involvement, forced displacement, slavery, genocide, and more. All of these are happening to students in Chicago public schools. So the nature of trauma is fragmentation. And here's kind of a rundown of the bodily and physiological kind of impact of trauma. So memory and emotion are disintegrated. They're split apart. So sometimes someone can recall a traumatic event in their life and have a completely flat affect, or someone could have like a hyper emotional response without any cognitive association or cognitive kind of starting points for that high stress response. It can kind of come out of nowhere. So emotions and kind of cognition are like disintegrated. Someone who's experienced trauma is likely to have hypervigilance and irritability, the inability to tune out certain stimuli. A reference point for my personal experience is I was living in Boston when the Boston Marathon bombings happened, and um, there was a whole week of commotion and chaos with a manhunt and two different shootouts. And um, if you put all the events of that week on a map, I lived in the middle of each of those events. We kind of made a triangle where I lived in the middle. For the next 6 months after that week, anytime I heard an emergency vehicle, siren, fire truck, police car, ambulance, it was not background noise for me. It was like it caught my attention and I couldn't tune it out. I zeroed in on it. And that's an example how we're just experiencing our environment differently when we've experienced trauma. Extended periods of negative emotional state, overall disorganization and dysregulation, including sleep, experiencing less stressful events as traumatic, disruption of healthy developmental stages. So think that a traumatic event has a different impact for fetus, infant, toddler, child, adolescent, teen, etc., as well as other dimensions to our identity. So I my friends who self-identify as LGBTQ plus experienced the Pulse nightclub shooting news very differently than other friends experienced that news. So different aspects of our identity influence the way we experience things, including trauma. And memories are stored out of sequence and in parts of our brain that aren't verbally accessible. So folks describe it as almost like a you took a bunch of Polaroids and just threw them on the floor. You've got snapshots of sensory input, smells, sounds, images, but there's not a coherent narrative put together. So that makes it really hard to speak about. So sometimes it's in just the depths of our psyche that we can't reach with words. What we'll talk about later is how we can lean on the arts because when our words fail, the arts can come in for our storytelling. And then the experience of trauma can recondition someone's stress response. So that's if you've experienced something traumatic, anytime our stress response kicks in, you've got a test coming up, you had an argument with a friend, you can have that full blown physiological traumatic response for smaller, lesser stressful events. So picking up on that it's stored in part of our brain that's not verbally accessible. Trauma is also in its nature unspeakable. It's difficult to um, talk about, especially when in our day-to-day lives we go through and encounter people and they say, "How's it going?" and they expect you to say, "Fine, how are you?" The author Dave Eggers likened the passing of his mother to someone asking about the weather, and it's like nuclear fallout. There's not a context for sharing something deeply painful in a lot of our interactions, which are kind of touch and go. So, folks who've experienced trauma experience the phenomenon in that as the conspiracy of silence, where collectively they've got something that you can't talk about and no one knows about it, and you feel like you're living behind glass. So, with that isolation comes feelings of shame, guilt, helplessness, settling in. Folks feel disconnected from their own life before the event. Like that previous self is kind of unfamiliar to them. An eroded sense of safety, meaning, belonging, and autonomy. Those all come from Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And then there's a cyclical nature to trauma. So Freud coined the term repetition compulsion, where people who've experienced trauma are observed to return to high risk, painful, difficult situations. that plays out in our relationships, that plays out in children's play, and in high risk behavior, if it's driving, or high risk hobbies. Um, I think of hang gliding or rock climbing. Or that's also compounded by unhealthy coping mechanisms, thinking of substance use or alcohol use.